Hello and welcome to part 5 of how to paint this Raven Guard Space Marine. In this video we're going to be looking at how to paint the leather pouch on his side. It's a fairly simple process and it doesn't require too many paints. If you look at the top left on the wet palette, you can see there are 3 wet paints. There's quite a few colours on there, but we're not going to be using them. It's colours that I've used for other things. So we're starting off using Rhinox hide and just very roughly blocking in brown all over the leather pouch. I think it's a gun holster actually, maybe a bolt pistol holster. But I mean that doesn't matter too much. But it's so just blocking in the colour. It doesn't have to be a smooth finish. There's going to be a lot of texture on this when we're finished, and having some of the black primer show through at this stage will just add to that effect. When applying the colour, actually, if you can focus a little bit on making sure the edges are slightly more opaque, whereas the centre area is going to be darker. So, but it's not super important at this stage because the layers will build up and that will be more obvious later. But it might help a little bit if you just make sure that the edges are a stronger brown, especially because that'll help with the transitions as you go along. So this is where you'll see the big change in contrast with using the colours. What you're actually going to find as well is, as you paint this, that the tonal contrast jumps are very high, and you might think, oh, this is too high, it looks really strong. And looking at the finished pictures, it's quite soft, but don't worry because we'll counter that later on in the video. At this stage it's just a case of using English uniform and focusing on all of the edges. Now the idea behind this is that the edges will wear more than the centre area of the holster. So, and also, so it has a realistic element, but also it helps to define the shape of the thing, so it works as a visual aid as well. And you can see there actually that I went back to the Rhinox hide, and it's a case of quite often when I do these videos when I'm painting that I'll swap backwards and forwards between colours quite often without washing my brush. I've mentioned this lots of times already now in previous videos, but it does allow you to do quick blends because the paint will mix on the brush and on the model as you apply it. So yeah, it's just a case of using the English uniform. I will provide Games Workshop alternatives as well. The exact colours don't matter too much as long as you have some browny colours. This pouch holster is going to be quite sort of yellowy leather, but you can get leather in all sorts of colours. So if you want a different colour, don't worry too much. You can go for it. You can use exactly the same techniques that I'm using here, just as long as you use appropriate stages of tone, so for the transitions. So you can see here that I'm doing lots and lots of little scratches, again using just the tip of the brush, and they're very fine marks. Don't always make sure when you're doing this kind of work that you can see on my thumb there how much paint is layered up on that. I probably end up with more paint on my thumb after a painting session than the model sometimes. But there's a very good reason for doing it like this when putting on these fine details, is that it takes away all of the excess of the paint on the brush, because if you try and do these small marks and there's too much paint on the brush, it will leave a heavy mark. You want very light, delicate marks, so you're taking away all of the excess paint and it'll just leave a very fine mark. And that's another reason why having the higher contrast paint helps a bit, so it makes the mark more visible, because when we come to glazing over it, if the mark was too fine, by the time you've glazed over it, it'll be invisible again. And sometimes that's quite handy. I mean, it won't be completely invisible, but it will be very hard to see. But sometimes that is nice on a model, just to have that variation. So when you're looking at it really closely, if you're doing it for display, it's there's more things to see as you get closer to the model. Completely useless if you're doing tabletop painting. So you might want to not bother about the super finest marks for tabletop type work, but the overall technique can work fine for tabletop gaming. You just have to do it in a more rough style, so it's clear from a distance. So you can see how also I built up the marks in the center, so there's kind of like a crease down the middle of the holster. You have to, it's kind of like controlled randomness when you apply these marks. You can see you have the rough areas where you want them, so at the bottom of the holster, and I've put some in the middle, and then you build up on those areas and things, and you need to do lots of, try and make them look random. The worst thing you can do is having lots of marks all facing in the same direction. The next bad thing you can do is having lots of marks all facing in the opposite direction to each other, so they look like little crosses everywhere. You need to do lines kind of from all directions and different line weights and things like that, and that's where the random element comes in a bit, is that you kind of just have to let your hand sort of flick about, going from all sorts of directions, but still controlling the rough area of where you want the paint to go. So again, focusing on making sure the edges are all worn more, and whatever other areas on the holster that you want to make stand out. So to a certain extent as well, apart from all the little scratch lines that you're putting on that build up and kind of change the colour of the leather a bit, is you can do kind of very rough stippling as well, and that just helps to create that rough kind of texture, but not as extreme as all the little lines. See at the moment there, it took just a little bit extra time because the top flap of the holster that covers the pistol, it's just a bit harder to reach because of the tassel coming down from the shoulder. So and also for that area you need it to be quite defined as well, because it's got a very distinct curve to it. So just make sure if you get some details like that on the leather that you pick them out. They still need all the scratches and stippling type effects, but you also want to make sure that the definition is there, and it has some hard edges, because otherwise what you end up is something looking very woolly, which is fine if you want to do kind of a wool effect, or something that looks super soft, but this should still have hard edges, being a fairly solid case to hold a pistol in. I've always wondered actually about the holsters that Games Workshop uses for their bolt pistols, because when you look at a bolt pistol on the model, they're actually huge and really wide, whereas on the holsters, the holsters are very thin. But this one actually has a pistol in it, so I'm assuming it's a bolt pistol, but it wouldn't look like a bolt pistol if you pulled it out. But anyway, that's besides the point. So the next step is to use the Japanese uniform. So what you may have already figured out is I'm using exactly the same colours on this as I use for the non-metallic gold on the chest, not including the Mournfang brown. So, and also not the ice yellow. So what this does is it you would think, oh, you're going to make everything look the same on the model, but missing out certain colours, particularly the Mournfang brown, actually changes the whole tone of the piece. And because there aren't the hard reflections and things like that, it works fine as a separate piece, and it doesn't clash with the gold at all. And what you'll find actually later on, when you see the video where I've painted the honours, the small golden trinkets and things that are hanging from the shoulder pad, because again they'll use the same colours, is that it won't clash with the pad, the holster too much. So it's quite often the case of how you apply paint and the secondary colours and things that you add, not just the base colours, that make a huge difference. But also it can have a nice effect as well. So if you wanted to create a kind of a whole, like a filter all over the model, what you'll actually find on this model is that because I've used Rhinox hide on nearly every part of it, like there's Rhinox hide glazed into the armour as well as the purple, it's only very subtle, but it keeps the whole tone of the model kind of linked. I mean, you don't always have to do that kind of thing, but it just makes it it helps to make the lighting more consistent, not in placement but in colour. So these marks that I'm putting on, it's exactly the same as the first process, but obviously to a much lesser degree. So you just pick, and they're very broken spots as well, much more sporadic, but still kept in the same areas. So don't put the Japanese uniform highlights on top of areas that are purely Rhinox hide. Only pick them onto areas that have already had quite a lot of English uniform on, and that's to show that these areas are extra worn. If you put the Japanese uniform on top of the dark areas, it'll create a really huge tonal contrast, and it won't work visually as an effect of worn leather. So again, excuse me. Again, there I'm just picking out the edges on the flap that folds over the top of the pistol. It might be for something like this that you actually don't stick the shoulder pad on before you paint it. On this model, I've been a little bit silly. I probably should have left off things like the sword and the backpack and the shoulder pad, like I did with the gun on the other arm as well. Also, the head is separate; it's blue tacked in, so you could actually blue tack all these bits. But there are advantages and disadvantages to doing that kind of thing, painting the model with blue tack on. And obviously the main advantage is you can take those parts off and paint underneath them. And it's probably something I would recommend if you're doing display level painting. But in this case I was just being lazy. But also what you'll find is when you're gluing the model together, it's very easy to damage the paintwork that you've done or find gaps in things and stuff like that. So it can be quite frustrating to spend a long time painting a bit of a model, so it's all finished, then glue it together and find the glue has damaged the paintwork. So it can create more work for you, and also it can just ruin whole things depending on which glue you use. Things like super glue, if it seeps out a little bit, it can go very frosty, or plastic glue will melt the paint, because it's acrylic paint. It will also melt the plastic, so you can have all sorts of catastrophes. So that's why I tend to glue the models together where I can, but it will limit your ability to paint things. So here, just to catch up with the painting, I'm now using Ushabti bone. And it's quite important that I'm using Ushabti bone and not ice yellow, because the ice yellow would really start to push the colours towards the non-metallic gold colours that I'm using as well. So I don't want exact colour copies from the different parts on the model, but just close enough that it keeps things tied together. But the nice thing about the Ushabti bone is it's a nice step up in tone for a highlight. It's still similar in colour to the previous two colours that I've used, or three, sorry. But it's still not too yellow, and it's a very good paint actually, Ushabti bone, for picking out the highlights, because it's quite a strong opaque colour. So now is where the part where we tie it all together. And again, going back to Rhinox hide glaze, it looks quite dark in the video, but it is Rhinox hide. Rhinox hides are dark brown anyway, but the light isn't going through the because it's a pool of water. Same as well, actually, if you look in the on the wet palette, it looks very dark, but it's actually Rhinox hide. So the idea is that you're glazing all these scratches together, and you're actually glazing over most of the whole holster. Now, you have to be a little bit careful, because if you glaze over the whole area too much, you'll completely kill all the highlights. But you also want the highlights to be, when I say highlights, I mean basically all the texture that you've painted on, but you want them to be much softer, and also you don't want the highlights to stand out too far. You want it all to look natural, so you have to really look at what you're doing and judge on whether the highlights need to be toned down, or you just need to shade into the recesses. And by recesses, so you've got that crease going across the middle of the holster. That's not really sculpted on, but it's painted on, but it's still, because of the way I've painted it, it's now actually like a more proud section than the recesses either side of it. So now you have to stick with that, the way that you painted it, basically. But yeah, just keep on glazing, and it's really important. I've mentioned quite a few times how to glaze, but really make sure that you rub the most of the paint off on a kitchen roll or whatever cloth that you use to wipe your brush on. You don't want the glaze pooling. It's supposed to dry. You can see already, as I go around the model, that it's already dried on the previous part that I've put the paint on. Because you need quite a lot of glazes here to tie everything together. You might think, I'm dulling down the textures too much, but actually you'll see, or maybe you won't see when my head's in the way. That was just me blowing on it, sorry. But you can see the glazed layers will build up, and it'll make the texture much more subtle. Because at the end of the day, it is just a gun holster. You don't want it to be to stand out too far. You don't want it to overpower or compete with the tactical marking on the shoulder pad and things like that. So there's the pouch all glazed down. It's a little bit hard to see because the light catches it a bit. I'm actually going to glaze a small amount of Xereus purple on it. It's only a very small amount, and again this kind of ties it's like a filter, because I've done the same on the armor with the purple glazing on there. And also purple works really nicely with the brown. It helps it to look darker, and if you get the right purples and browns mixed together, it'll almost look black. So but glazing over it on some of the lighter brown areas will just add that purple tint to it as well. So you're adding extra colours, it makes it more interesting, and it's also helping to darken it down. There's just a little a little cheeky glaze on the lower leg as well. But that's apart from a few more glazes, that's pretty much the extent of the painting needed for this sort of leather look. One thing you'll notice actually on the pouch is that it's quite shiny at the minute. So actually what I'm going to do here is use matte varnish to tone it down. I'm using AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. It's my favourite matte varnish. It works really nicely. Quite often I apply it with an airbrush. I'm not going to be matting down this whole model. I like the satin finish on the armour, but certain areas like this leather pouch really benefit from having a matte coat on it, because that again creates a contrast in between having satin and matte finish, and also allows you just to see the texture a little bit more easily on the pouch, because the light isn't reflecting on it then. It does take a moment to dry, but and I'll put a photo at the end of the video as well, so you can see the proper finished effect. So that's pretty much it. And there's a photo close up where you can see the pouch, and you can see how the texture is really fine now, and it all just blends together nicely. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.